Okay. I think we're good to go. Uh, Getting some fluid in me. All right. So yeah, sorry I haven't had any other streams throughout this past week. It has been busy, very, very, very busy. And will probably continue to do so, but I'm going to, after this coming week, I should have a bit more control over what days, uh, a bit more control over my general schedule flow. So I should be able to get back to a streaming schedule that is resembling my previous norm, but we'll see. Um, let's see here. So last week we read the first couple stories in William Gibson's Burning Chrome, Fragments of a Hologram Rose, The Gernsback Continuum, and Johnny Mnemonic. Mnemonic. That doesn't come across well, does it? You can't really tell. I eschewed, or decided not to, I should say, read the introduction passages. There's a preface by Bruce Sterling, um, which is pretty good. It gives you some context. And then there's an introduction by William Gibson, which also provides some context. But I decided to not read those. I do kind of like to read stuff like that, but eh. Reading it aloud for one of these just seems a little out of place at this time. Um, so today we're looking at definitely at least two stories, The Belonging Kind and Hinterlands. Um, I kind of want to do uh, Red Star Winter Orbit as well, which is pretty cool. It's got lots of Russians in it, which is very nice. I can do a Russian voice, even though it is not very accurate to Russian English. Oh well. You have characters like Korolev, Filipchenko, Umansky, and Plummer. Great Russian name, Plummer. I will probably wind up doing Red Star Winter Orbit. We'll see when we get there. How my throat is doing because I had a cold throughout the last week, kind of on and off, where I had like swollen lymph nodes and they're kind of just receding now. Alrighty. Oh, I forgot to turn this off. Hello. There we go. A Burning Chrome cover from the 80s? I don't know. I should really pay much more attention where I find these so I can give proper credit, but I think that's a cool cover for Burning Chrome. Okay, dokie. Let me just get all set up right here. I am, for what it's worth, reading an actual physical edition of the book. Sometimes I read, like anytime I'm doing stuff that I've gotten from Project Gutenberg, like some of those astounding stories of science fiction. Those are all those are all digital, and I'm using a mouse and keyboard to navigate those. But much of the other stuff that I ever wind up reading is going to be it's going to be um, physical books most of the time. Oh, that's right. I just learned that Greg Egan, who I'm quite fond of, um, published a new short story collection, which I didn't know he had done, self-published, as it turns out. So I have to get a hold of that. I read the entirety of his axiomatic short story collection back early on in these, and I really dig that one. That's like one of my favorite short story collections of all time. But particularly that one. What is it called? I think it's instantiation. Instantiation. INS as in Sarah. TAN as in Nancy. TIATION. instantiation, something like that. In any case, it's a short story collection by my main crazy Australian man, Greg Egan, and I'm definitely going to get around to that. He also released a new novel, like in 2018, which I completely missed, and I'm sort of upset. Um, called Dichronauts, which is kind of, uh, kind of sorta like, oh, what's it called? The Clockwork Rocket or Arrow of Time trilogy. In that, like, the book is any characters in the book are kind of gonna be pretty plain Jane, like really basic. They serve a function, and that's about it. But and the plot is gonna be kind of basic, but mostly it's about working within the confines of a certain set of physical laws. In the case of Dichronauts, let me read the description here, which I think it's very cool. So the description starts off with a children's rhyme. 5 steps forward, 3 steps right, are 4 steps off the path, but keep you safe in sight. 3 steps forward, 5 steps right, are 4 steps into cider land, out of the light. Children's rhyme. Seth is a surveyor, along with his friend Theo, a leech-like creature running through his skull who tells Seth what lies to his left and right. Theo, in turn, relies on Seth for mobility, and for ordinary vision looking forwards and backwards. Like everyone else in their world, they are symbionts, depending on each other to survive. In the universe containing Seth's world, light cannot travel in all directions. There is a dark cone to the north and south. Seth can only face to the east, or west if he tips his head backwards. If he starts to turn to the north or south, his body stretches out across the landscape, and to rotate to face northeast is every bit as impossible as accelerating to the speed of light. Every living thing in Seth's world is in a state of perpetual migration as they follow the sun's shifting orbit and the narrow habitable zone it creates. Cities are being constantly disassembled at one edge and rebuilt at the other, with surveyors mapping safe routes ahead. But when Seth and Theo join an expedition to the edge of the habitable zone, they discover a terrifying threat. A fissure in the surface of the world, so deep and wide that no one can perceive its limits. As the habitable zone continues to move, the migration will soon be blocked by this unbridgeable void, and the expedition has only one option to save its city from annihilation: descend into the unknown. And if that doesn't sound like a thrilling good time to you, Greg Egan probably is not your bag. It sounds like a combination of the Arrow of Time trilogy that Egan did, as well as a short story he did in Axiomatic, whose name eludes me at the moment, where there are these weird singularities that pop up from time to time, and the protagonist of the story is somebody who will run into these and try and get people out or to this safe zone towards the center. Um, and you can't ever move backwards. You can only move forwards. You can move from side to side, but you can never do any. You can't. Moving backwards is impossible. So you have to go towards the center. And so if you're constantly dragged that way too. So like if you're trapped in a house, uh, and you get stuck in a corner, you're dead. You die horribly, crushed slowly and inexorably. You stop being able to breathe and all that. Um, Physics basically are altered on a fundamental level. I don't remember the name of that short story though, and it's killing me. No, this is just a best of collection, which is basically axiomatic with some of the stories from the new one. Instantiation. What? Into Darkness, it probably is. Yeah. I don't think it was Unstable Orbits in the Space of Lies. Pretty sure it was Into Darkness. Good stuff. In any case, I think he's a great author. His short stories absolutely make it for me. His novels are much more hit or miss, in my opinion. Um, they're good if you have the slightest idea of like the basic principles he's talking about. But if you don't, you just kind of feel a little dumb, like me. So like the first six novels he did make are really good. I know some people don't recommend a book he did called Zendegi because it's what's a nice way to put this? It's kind of boring. It's kind of humdrum. But it's almost certainly his most accessible work. But we're not talking about Greg Egan now. I should have led with that as opposed to bringing it up in the middle. So we're now getting back to William Gibson's Burning Chrome short story collection. Just give me 1 sec and I will be ready to read. Alrighty, sorry about that. The Belonging Kind by John Shirley and William Gibson. It might have been in Club Justine, or Jimbo's, or Sad Jack's, or the Rafters. Coretti could never be sure where he'd first seen her. At any time, she might have been in any one of those bars. She swam through the submarine half-life of bottles and glassware and the slow swirl of cigarette smoke. She moved through her natural element, one bar after another. Now, Coretti remembered their first meeting as if he saw it through the wrong end of a powerful telescope, small and clear and very far away. He had noticed her first in the back door lounge. It was called the back door because you entered through a narrow back alley. The alley's walls crawled with graffiti, its caged lights ticked with moths. Flakes from its white painted bricks crunched underfoot. And then you pushed through into a dim space inhabited by a faintly confusing sense of the half dozen other bars that had tried and failed in the same room under different managements. Coretti sometimes went there because he liked the weary smile of the black bartender, and because the few customers rarely tried to get chummy. He wasn't very good at conversation with strangers, not at parties and not in bars. He was fine at the community college where he lectured in introductory linguistics. He could talk with the head of his department about sequencing and options in conversational openings, but he could never talk to strangers in bars or parties. He didn't go to many parties. He went to a lot of bars. Coretti didn't know how to dress. Clothing was a language, and Coretti a kind of sartorial stutterer, unable to make the kind of basic coherent fashion statement that would put strangers at their ease. His ex-wife told him he dressed like a Martian, that he didn't look as though he belonged anywhere in the city. He hadn't liked her saying that, because it was true. He hadn't ever had a girl like the one who sat with her back arched slightly in the undersea light that splashed along the bar in the back door. The same light was screwed into the lenses of the bartender's glasses, wound into the necks of the rows of bottles, splashed dully across the mirror. In that light her dress was the green of young corn, like a husk half stripped away, showing back and cleavage and lots of thigh through the slits up the side. Her hair was coppery that night, and, that night, her eyes were green. He pushed resolutely between the empty chrome and formica tables until he reached the bar, where he ordered up a straight bourbon. He took off his duffel coat and wound up holding it on his lap when he sat down one stool away from her. Great, he screamed to himself. She'll think you're hiding an erection. And he was startled to realize that he had one to hide. He studied himself in the mirror behind the bar, a 30ish man with thinning dark hair and a pale, narrow face on a long neck, too long for the open collar of the nylon shirt printed with engravings of 1910 automobiles in three vivid colors. He wore a tie with broad maroon and black diagonals, too narrow, he supposed, for what he now saw was as the too narrow, he supposed, for what he now saw as the grotesquely long points of his collar. Or it was the wrong color. Something. Beside him, in the dark clarity of the mirror, the green-eyed woman looked like Irma la Douce. But looking closer, studying her face, he shivered. A face like an animal's. A beautiful face, but simple, cunning, two-dimensional. When she senses you're looking at her, Coretti thought, she'll give you the smile, disdainful amusement, or whatever you'd expect. Coretti blurted, "May I, buy you a drink?" At moments like these, Coretti was possessed by an agonizingly stiff, schoolmasterish linguistic tic. Um, he winced. Um. You would, like to buy me a drink? Why, how kind of you, she said, astonishing him. That would be very nice. Distantly, he noticed that her reply was as stilted and insecure as his own. She added, "A Tom Collins on this occasion would be lovely." On this occasion? Lovely? Rattled, Coretti ordered 2 drinks and paid. A big woman in jeans and an embroidered cowboy shirt bellied up to the bar beside him and asked the bartender for change. "Well, hey!" she said. Then she strutted to the jukebox and punched for Conway and Loretta's "You're the Reason Our Kids Are Ugly." Coretti turned to the woman in green and murmured haltingly, "Do you enjoy country and western music?" "Do you enjoy?" He groaned secretly at his phrasing and tried to smile. "Yes, indeed," she answered, and the faintest twang edging her voice. "I sure do." The cowgirl sat down beside him and asked her, winking, "This little terror here giving you a hard time?" And the animal-eyed lady in green replied, "Oh, hell no, honey, I got my eye on him," and laughed, just the right amount of laugh. The part of Coretti that was dialectologist, sorry, the part of Coretti that was dialectologist stirred uneasily. Too perfect a shift in phrasing and inflection. An actress? A talented mimic? The word mimetic rose suddenly in his mind, but he pushed it aside to study her reflection in the mirror. The rows of bottle occluded her breasts like a gown of glass. "The name's Coretti," he said, his verbal poltergeist shifting abruptly to a totally unconvincing tough guy mode. "Michael Coretti." "A pleasure," she said, too softly for the other woman to hear, and again she had slipped into the lame parody of Emily Post. "Conway and Loretta," said the cowgirl, to no one in particular. "Antoinette," said the woman in green, and inclined her head. She finished her drink, pretended to glance at a watch, said "Thank you for the drink" too damn politely, and left. 10 minutes later, Coretti was following her down Third Avenue. He had never followed anyone in his life, and it both frightened and excited him. 40 feet seemed a discreet distance, but what should he do if she happened to glance over her shoulder? Third Avenue isn't a dark street, and it was there, in the light of a street lamp, like a stage light, that she began to change. The street was deserted. She was crossing the street. She stepped off the curb, and it began. It began with tints in her hair. At first he thought they were reflections. But there was no neon there to cast the blobs of color that appeared, color sliding and merging like oil slicks. Then the colors bled away, and in 3 seconds she was white blonde. He was sure it was a trick of the light until her dress began to writhe, twisting across her body like shrink-wrap plastic. Part of it fell away entirely and lay in curling shreds on the pavement, shed like the skin of some fabulous animal. When Coretti passed, it was green foam, fizzing, dissolving, gone. He looked back up at her, and the dress was another dress, green satin, shifting with reflections. Her shoes had changed too. Her shoulders were bare except for thin straps that crossed at the small of her back. Her hair had become short, spiky. He found that he was leaning against a jeweler's plate glass window, his breath coming ragged and harsh with the damp of the autumn evening. He heard the disco's heartbeat from 2 blocks away. As she neared it, her movements began subtly to take on a new rhythm, a shift in emphasis in the sway of her hips, in the way she put her heels down on the sidewalk. The doorman let her pass with a vague nod. He stopped Coretti and stared at his driver's license and frowned at his duffel coat. Coretti anxiously scanned the wash of lights at the top of a milky plastic stairway beyond the doorman. She had vanished there, into robotic flashing and redundant thunder. Grudgingly, the man let him pass, and he pounded up the stairs, his haste disturbing the lights beneath the translucent plastic steps. Coretti had never been in a disco before. He found himself in an environment designed for complete satisfaction in distraction. He waded nervously through the motion and the fashions and the mechanical urban chants booming from the huge speakers. He sought her almost blindly on the pose-clotted dance floor amid strobe lights, and found her at the bar, drinking a tall, lurid cooler and listening to a young man who wore a loose shirt of pale silk and very tight black pants. She nodded at what Coretti took to be appropriate intervals. Coretti ordered by pointing at a bottle of bourbon. She drank 5 of the tall drinks and then followed the young man to the dance floor. She moved in perfect accord with the music, striking a series of poses. She went through the entire prescribed sequence, gracefully but not artfully, fitting in perfectly. Always, always fitting in perfectly. Her companion danced mechanically, moving through the ritual with effort. When the dance ended, she turned abruptly and dived into the thick of the crowd. The shifting throng closed about her like something molten. Coretti plunged in after her, his eyes never leaving her, and he was the only one to follow her change. By the time she reached the stair, she was auburn-haired and wore a long blue dress. A white flower blossomed in her hair, behind her right ear. Her hair was longer and straighter now. Her breasts had become slightly larger, and her hips a shade heavier. She took the stairs 2 at a time, and he was afraid for her then. All those drinks. But the alcohol seemed to have had no effect on her at all. Never taking his eyes from her, Coretti followed, his heartbeat outspeeding the disco throb at his back, sure that at any moment she would turn, glare at him, call for help. 2 blocks down Third, she turned in at Lothario's. There was something different in her step now. Lothario's was a quiet complex of rooms hung with ferns and Art Deco mirrors. There were fake Tiffany lamps hanging from the ceiling, alternating with wooden-bladed fans that rotated too slowly to stir the wisps of smoke drifting through the consciously mellow drone of conversation. After the disco, Lothario's was familiar and comforting. A jazz pianist in pinstriped shirt sleeves and loosely knotted tie competed softly with talk and laughter from a dozen tables. She was at the bar. The stools were only half taken, but Coretti chose a wall table, in the shadow of a miniature palm, and ordered bourbon. He drank the bourbon and ordered another. He couldn't feel the alcohol much tonight. She sat beside a young man, yet another young man with the usual set of bland, regular features. He wore a yellow golf shirt and pressed jeans. Her hip was touching his, just a little. They didn't seem to be speaking, but Coretti felt they were somehow communing. They were leaning toward one another slightly, silent. Coretti felt odd. He went to the restroom and splashed his face with water. Coming back, he managed to pass within 3 feet of them. Their lips didn't move till he was within earshot. They took turns murmuring realistic palaver. "Saw his earlier films, but he's rather self-indulgent, don't you think?" "Sure, but in the sense that And for the first time, Coretti knew what they were, what they must be. They were the kind you see in bars who seem to have grown there, who seem genuinely at home there. Not drunks, but human fixtures, functions of the bar, the belonging kind. Something in him yearned for a confrontation. He reached his table, but found himself unable to sit down. He turned, took a deep breath, and walked woodenly toward the bar. He wanted to tap her on her smooth shoulder and ask who she was, and exactly what she was, and point out the cold irony of the fact that it was he, Coretti, the Martian dresser, the eavesdropper, the outsider, the one whose clothes and conversation never fit, who had at last guessed their secret. But his nerve broke, and he merely took a seat beside her and ordered bourbon. "But don't you think," she asked her companion, "that it's all relative?" The two seats beyond her companion were quickly taken by a couple who were talking politics. Antoinette, in golf shirt, took up the political theme seamlessly, recycling, speaking just loudly enough to be overheard. Her face, as she spoke, was expressionless, a bird trilling on a limb. She sat so easily on her stool, as if it were a nest. Golf shirt paid for the drinks. He always had the exact change, unless he wanted to leave a tip. Coretti watched them work their way methodically through 6 cocktails each, like insects feeding on nectar. But their voices never grew louder, their cheeks didn't redden, and when at last they stood, they moved without a trace of drunkenness. A weakness, thought Coretti, a gap in their camouflage. They paid him absolutely no attention while he followed them through 3 successive bars. As they entered Wayland's, they metamorphosed so quickly that Coretti had trouble following the stages of the change. It was one of those places with toilet doors marked pointers and setters, and a little imitation pine plaque over the jars of beef jerky and pickled sausages. "We've got a deal with the bank. They don't serve beer, and we don't cash checks." She was plump in Wayland's, and there were dark hollows under her eyes. There were coffee stains on her polyester pantsuit. Her companion wore jeans, a T-shirt, and a red baseball cap with a red and white Peterbilt patch. Coretti risked losing them when he spent a frantic minute in pointers, blinking in confusion at a hand-lettered cardboard sign that said, "We aim to please. You aim too." Third Avenue lost itself near the waterfront in a petrified snarl of brickwork. In the last block, bright vomit marked the pavement at intervals, and old men dozed in front of black and white TVs, sealed forever behind the fogged plate glass of faded hotels. The bar they found there had no name. An ace of diamonds was gradually flaking away on the unwashed window, and the bartender had a face like a closed fist. An FM transistor in ivory plastic keened easily bleh. An FM transistor in ivory plastic keened easy listening rock to the uneven ranks of deserted tables. They drank beer and shots. They were old now, 2 ciphers who drank and smoked in the light of bare bulbs, coughing over a pack of crumpled Camels she produced from the pocket of a dirty tan raincoat. At 2:25 they were in the rooftop lounge of the new hotel complex that rose above the waterfront. She wore an evening dress, and he wore a dark suit. They drank cognac and pretended to admire the city lights. They each had 3 cognacs, while Coretti watched them over 2 ounces of wild turkey in a Waterford crystal highball glass. They drank until last call. Coretti followed them into the elevator. They smiled politely, but otherwise ignored him. There were 2 cabs in front of the hotel. They took one, Coretti the other. "Follow that cab," said Coretti huskily, thrusting his last 20 at the aging hippie driver. "Sure, man, sure." The driver dogged the other cab for 6 blocks to another, more modest hotel. They got out and went in. Coretti slowly climbed out of his cab, breathing hard. He ached with jealousy. For the personification of conformity, this woman who was not a woman, this human wallpaper. Coretti gazed at the hotel and lost his nerve. He turned away. He walked home, 16 blocks. At some point, he realized that he wasn't drunk. Not drunk at all. In the morning, he phoned in to cancel his early class, but his hangover never quite came. His mouth wasn't desiccated, and staring at himself in the bathroom mirror, he saw that his eyes weren't bloodshot. In the afternoon, he slept and dreamed of sheep-faced people reflected in mirrors behind rows of bottles. That night, he went out to dinner, alone, and ate nothing. The food looked back at him, somehow. He stirred it about to make it look as if he'd eaten a little, paid, and went to a bar. And another bar, looking for her. He was using his credit card now, though he was already badly in the hole under Visa. If he saw her, he didn't recognize her. Sometimes he watched the hotel he'd seen her go into. He looked carefully at each of the couples who came and went. Not that he'd be able to spot her from her looks alone, but there should be a feeling, some kind of intuitive recognition. He watched the couples, and he was never sure. In the following weeks, he systematically visited every boozy watering hole in the city. Armed at first with a city map and 5 torn yellow pages, he gradually progressed to the more obscure establishments, places with unlisted numbers. Some had no phone at all. He joined dubious private clubs, discovered unlicensed after-hours retreats where you brought your own, and sat nervously in dark rooms devoted to areas of fringe sexuality that he had not known existed. But he continued on what became his nightly circuit. He always began at the back door. She was never there, or in the next place, or the next. The bartenders knew him, and they liked to see him come in, because he bought drinks continuously, and never seemed to get drunk. So he stared at the other customers a bit. So what? Coretti lost his job. He'd missed classes too many times. He'd taken to watching the hotel when he could, even in the daytime. He'd been seen in too many bars. He never seemed to change his clothes. He refused night classes. He would let a lecture trail off in the middle as he turned to gaze vacantly out the window. He was secretly pleased at being fired. They had looked at him oddly at faculty lunches when he couldn't eat his food. And now he had more time for the search. Coretti found her at 2:15 on a Wednesday morning in a gay bar called The Barn. Paneled in rough wood and hung with halters and rusting farm equipment, the place was shrill with perfume and laughter and beer. She was everyone's giggling sister, in a blue sequined dress, a green feather in her coiffed brown hair. Through a sweeping sense of almost cellular relief, Coretti was aware of a kind of admiration, a strange pride he now felt in her, and her kind. Here, too, she belonged. She was a representative type, a fag hag who posed no threat to the queens or their butch boys. Her companion had become an ageless man with carefully silvered temples, an Angora sweater, and a trench coat. They drank, and went laughing just the right sort of laughter, out into the rain. A cab was waiting, its wipers duplicating the beat of Coretti's heart. Jockeying clumsily across the wet sidewalk, Coretti scurried into the cab, dreading their reaction. Coretti was in the back seat, beside her. The man with silver temples spoke to the driver. The driver muttered into his hand mic, changed gears, and they flowed away into the rain and the darkened streets. The cityscape made no impression on Coretti, who, looking inwardly, was seeing the cab stop, the gray man and the laughing woman pushing him out and pointing, smiling, to the gate of a mental hospital. Or, the cab stopping, the couple turning, sadly shaking their heads. And a dozen times he seemed to see the cab stopping in an empty side street where they methodically throttled him. Coretti left dead in the rain, because he was an outsider. But they arrived at Coretti's hotel. In the dim glow of the cab's dome light he watched closely as the man reached into his coat for the fare. Coretti could see the coat's lining clearly, and it was one piece with the Angora sweater. No wallet bulged there, and no pocket. But a kind of slit widened. It opened as the man's fingers poised over it, and it disgorged money. 3 bills, folded, were extruded smoothly from the slit. The money was slightly damp. It dried as the man unfolded it, like the wings of a moth just emerging from the chrysalis. "Keep the change," said the belonging man, climbing out of the cab. Antoinette slid out, and Coretti followed, his mind seeing only the slit. The slit wet, edged with red, like a gill. The lobby was deserted, and the desk clerk bent over a crossword. The couple drifted silently across the lobby and into the elevator, Coretti close behind. Once he tried to catch her eye, but she ignored him. And once, as the elevator rose 7 floors above Coretti's own, she bent over and sniffed at the chrome wall ashtray, like a dog snuffling at the ground. Hotels, late at night, are never still. The corridors are never entirely silent. There are countless barely audible sighs, the rustling of sheets, and muffled voices speaking fragments out of sleep. But in the ninth-floor corridor, Coretti seemed to move through a perfect vacuum, soundless, his shoes making no sound at all on the colorless carpet, and even the beating of his outsider's heart sucked away into the vague pattern that decorated the wallpaper. He tried to count the small plastic ovals screwed on the doors, each with its own 3 figures, but the corridor seemed to go on forever. At last the man halted before a door veneered like all the rest with imitation rosewood, and put his hand over the lock, his palm flat against the metal. Something scraped softly, and then the mechanism clicked, and the door swung open. As the man withdrew his hand, Coretti saw a grayish-pink, key-shaped sliver of bone retract wetly into the pale flesh. No light burned in that room, but the city's dim neon aura filtered in through Venetian blinds and allowed him to see the faces of the dozen or more people who sat perched on the bed and the couch and the armchairs and the stools in the kitchenette. At first he thought that their eyes were open, but then he realized that the dull pupils were sealed beneath nictitating membranes, third eyelids that reflected the faint shades of neon from the window. They wore whatever the last bar had called for, a shapeless Salvation Army shapeless shal bleh. They wore whatever the last bar had called for. Shapeless Salvation Army overcoats sat beside bright suburban leisure wear, evening gowns beside dusty factory clothes, biker's leather by brushed Harris tweed. With sleep, all spurious humanity had vanished. They were roosting. His couple seated themselves on the edge of the formica countertop in the kitchenette, and Coretti hesitated in the middle of the empty carpet. Light years of that carpet seemed to separate him from the others, but something called to him across the distance, promising rest and peace and belonging. And still he hesitated, shaking with an indecision that seemed to rise from the genetic core of his body's every cell. Until they opened their eyes, all of them simultaneously, the membranes sliding sideways to reveal the alien calm of dwellers of the ocean's darkest trench. Coretti screamed, and ran away, and fled along corridors and down echoing concrete stairwells to cool rain and the nearly empty streets. Coretti never returned to his room on the 3rd floor of that hotel. A bored house detective collected the linguistics texts, the single suitcase of clothing, and they were eventually sold at auction. Coretti took a room in a boarding house run by a grim Baptist teetotaler who led her roomers in prayer at the start of every overcooked evening meal. She didn't mind that Coretti never joined them for those meals. He explained that he was given free meals at work. He lied freely and skillfully. He never drank at the boarding house, and he never came home drunk. Mr. Coretti was a little odd, but always paid his rent on time. and he was very quiet. Coretti stopped looking for her. He stopped going to bars. He drank out of a paper bag while going to and from his job at a publisher's warehouse, in an area whose industrial zoning permitted few bars. He worked nights. Sometimes, at dawn, perched on the edge of his unmade bed, drifting into sleep, he never slept lying down now, he thought about her, Antoinette, and them, the belonging kind. Sometimes he speculated dreamily. Perhaps they were like house mice, the sort of small animal evolved to live only in the walls of man-made structures. A kind of animal that lives only on alcoholic beverages. With peculiar metabolisms, they convert the alcohol and the various proteins from mixed drinks and wine and beers into everything they need. And they can change outwardly, like a chameleon or a rockfish, for protection. So they can live amongst us. And maybe, Coretti thought, they grow in stages. In the early stages, seeming like humans, eating the food humans eat, sensing their difference only in a vague disquiet of being an outsider. A kind of animal with its own cunning, its own special set of urban instincts, and the ability to know its own kind when they're near. Maybe. And maybe not. Coretti drifted into sleep. On a Wednesday, 3 weeks into his new job, his landlady opened the door, she never knocked, and told him that he was wanted on the phone. Her voice was tight with habitual suspicion, and Coretti followed her along the dark hallway to the second-floor sitting room and the telephone. Lifting the old-fashioned black instrument to his ear, he heard only music at first, and then a wall of sound resolving into a fragmented amalgam of conversations, laughter. No one spoke to him over the sound of the bar, but the song in the background was "You're the Reason Our Kids Are Ugly." And then the dial tone, when the caller hung up. Later, alone in his room, listening to the landlady's firm tread in the room below, Coretti realized that there was no need to remain where he was. The summons had come. But the landlady demanded 3 weeks' notice if anyone wanted to leave. That meant that Coretti owed her money. Instinct told him to leave it for her. A Christian working man in the next room coughed in his sleep as Coretti got up and went down the hall to the telephone. Coretti told the evening shift foreman that he was quitting his job. He hung up and went back to his room, locked the door behind him, and slowly removed his clothing until he stood naked before the garish framed lithograph of Jesus above the brown steel bureau. And then he counted out 9 tens. He placed them carefully beside the praying hands plaque decorating the bureau top. It was nice-looking money. It was perfectly good money. He made it himself. This time he didn't feel like making small talk. She'd been drinking a margarita, and he ordered the same. She paid, producing the money with a deft movement of her hand between the breasts bobbling in her low-cut dress. He glimpsed the gill closing there. An excitement rose in him, but somehow, this time, it didn't center in an erection. After the third margarita, their hips were touching, and something was spreading through him in slow, orgasmic waves. It was sticky where they were touching, an area the size of the heel of his thumb where the cloth had parted. He was two men, the one inside fusing with her in total cellular communion, and the shell, who sat casually on a stool at the bar, elbows on either side of his drink, fingers toying with a swizzle stick, smiling benignly into space, calm in the cool dimness. And once, but only once, some distant, worrisome part of him made Coretti glance down to where soft ruby tubes pulsed, tendrils tipped with sharp lips worked in the shadows between them, like the joining tentacles of two strange anemones. They were mating, and no one knew. And the bartender, when he brought the next drink, offered his tired smile and said, "Raining out now, ain't it? Just won't let up." "Been raining like that all goddamn week," Coretti answered. "Raining to beat the band." And he said it right, like a real human being. And that was The Belonging Kind by John Shirley and William Gibson. Some real Stephen Kingsy type shit up in here. We bring you the good stuff. Only the best. So yeah, creepy mimic mutants that evolve to survive in an environment composed of bars and social situations. I'm sure there's some of us who have. I like the idea because it's got a lot to do with like alienation. Um, I guess in some ways it's sort of like an introvert's wet dream. Like, oh, I want to be able to blend with the crowd. I want to be able to not feel completely out of my depth in insert social situation or social function here. I think a lot of us can relate to that in some ways. Not, the tentacles coming out of our hips and mating thing, but, the rest of it. You know, wait, you mean you people don't pull money out of your gills? Oh, shit. Oh, shit. Nothing to see here. We're not barfly mutants. All right. So yeah, a bunch of these short stories are like co-authored, and I don't know like chicken versus egg on that in terms of like I don't know if it's like they both wrote part of it and then like sent it to the other and then sent it like one author writes a bit, sends it to the other author writes a bit, sends it back, because that's kind of my understanding of how geez, what is that book called? It's like the quintessential steampunk novel by William Gibson and name that eludes. I've got it right here. Give me a sec. Now I have to find it. Yeah, William Gibson and Bruce Sterling, The Difference Engine, which is like the quintessential steampunk novel that if you have an interest in steampunk, uh, Victorian era steampunk. I should maybe be specific because I guess there's a difference. I'm not into super aware of what that genre has done lately. Um, that one is highly worth reading. The Difference Engine, and that basically was written like one author would write like a chapter or a chunk of a chapter and then send the manuscript to the other author and rinse, wash, repeat until book is done, which is a crazy, insane way to make a book, but they did it, and it's actually pretty good. There are bits in there that drag, but it's pretty good. One of the things you're probably noticing in these William Gibson short stories is maximum over detail. There's a lot of that, and the way some of the sentences flow has like really weird bits of alliteration sometimes. Uh, and the sentences, because of the maximum over detail, wind up being incredibly long. So I wind up like bungling them half the time, and for that I apologize, but deal with it. Cry me a river, I guess. I'm doing this. And I'm doing my best. I'm trying so hard. Uh, but here we are. Let me get a little fluid in me here. Uh, that last one wasn't especially cyberpunk-y. Not all of these stories are. This next one is a bit more so. At some point, I will actually read the short story called Cyberpunk, which is by a guy whose name I don't remember right now. I have that floating around. Um, That one's kind of essential. Um, I also have to find where my copy of Mirror Shades went. I have it. It's somewhere. I hope I didn't lose it in the move. I will be upset because I lost a bunch of books when I moved to where I currently live. And like it's like one box of books, and I'm not pleased that I can't find certain things. Whatever. Um, let me flip to the right page. Probably a good idea. All right, so this next one is Hinterlands. It's a little more cyberpunk than the last one was, but the last one was super cool. I don't know that I'm going to get to the story after it, but we'll see. It's pretty cool, but I have other things I need to do today, so I need to figure that out. So we'll get through this next. We'll get through Hinterlands and we'll see. How many more stories are in here? Okay, yeah, the Winter Market. I forgot about that one. I haven't read this in forever. Um, this Burning Chrome short story collection. So a lot of it is kind of like rereading it the first time, reading it for the first time. It's tough. It's tough. Um, I like cyberpunk as a genre, but I think there is such a thing as too much of a good thing. There's a lot of there is some very good cyberpunk literature out there, but there's also a lot of really, really like okay, dubious stuff. A lot of stuff that's edgy for the sake of being edgy. A lot of stuff that's like literally let's do try to do somebody read it's like somebody read Neuromancer and then tried to emulate it but really didn't know how, like didn't get the context or missed some key aspect and it just all the facade comes tumbling down. There's a lot of that out there. Um, the reason Snow Crash winds up working as well as it does, and I will hold Snow Crash to a as a pretty high on a high pedestal, really good cyberpunk novel, is that it's basically a satire of cyberpunk while also being an incredibly good cyberpunk novel. Like it's basically the entire time it's taking the piss out of like cyberpunk conventions and then also working. Even though it's making fun of the thing, it's working on that same level. So it Snow Crash is remarkable. I read that one aloud. I know some people have listened to that and enjoyed it. I recommend it. Now I'm getting back to reading. Hinterlands by William Gibson. When Hero hit the switch, I was dreaming of Paris, dreaming of wet, dark streets in winter. The pain came oscillating up from the floor of my skull, exploding behind my eyes in a wall of blue neon. I jackknifed up out of the mesh hammock, screaming. I always scream. I make a point of it. Feedback raged in my skull. The pain switch is an auxiliary circuit in the bone phone implant, patched directly to the pain centers, just the thing for cutting through a surrogate's barbiturate fog. It took a few seconds for my life to fall together, icebergs of biography looming through the fog. Who I was, where I was, what I was doing there, who was waking me. Hero's voice came crackling into my head through the bone conduction implant. Damn, Toby, know what it does to my ears, you scream like that? Know how much I care about your ears, Dr. Nagashima? I care about them as much as no time for the litany of love, boy. We've got business. But what is it with these 50 millivolt spike waves off your temporals, eh? Mixing something with the downers to give it a little color? Your EEG's screwed, Hero. You're crazy. I just want my sleep. I collapsed into the hammock and tried to pull the darkness over me, but his voice was still there. Sorry, my man, but you're working today. We got a ship back an hour ago. Airlock gang are out there right now, sawing the reaction engine off, so she'll be just about. Blah. Let's try that again. Sorry, my man, but you're working today. We got a ship back an hour ago. Airlock gang are out there right now, sawing the reaction engine off, so she'll just about fit through the door. Who is it? Oh my God. Lenny Hofmannsthal, Toby, physical chemist, citizen of the Federal Republic of Germany. He waited until I quit groaning. It's a confirmed meat shot. Lovely workaday terminology we've developed out here. He meant a returning ship with active medical telemetry. Contents 1. Number 1. Body warm. Psychological status as yet unconfirmed. I shut my eyes and swung there in the dark. Looks like you're her surrogate, Toby. Her profile syncs with Taylor's, but he's on leave. I knew all about Taylor's leave. He was out in the agricultural canisters, ripped on it. Oh my God, why? Why are there so many of these multisyllabic chemical names? I'm so sorry. Why have I done this to myself? Uh, amitriptyline. He was out in the agricultural canisters, ripped on amitriptyline, doing aerobic exercises to counter his latest bout with clinical depression. One of the occupational hazards of being a surrogate. Taylor and I don't get along. Funny how you usually don't, if the guy's psychosexual profile is too much like your own. Hey, Toby, where are you getting all that dope? The question was ritual. From Charmian? Charmian? Charmian. Charmian. Oh, I did the wrong voice. Okay. I'm still confused as to who's who right now. Hey, Toby, where are you getting all the dope? All that dope. The question was ritual. From Charmian? From your mom, hero. He knows it's Charmian as well as I do. Thanks, Toby. Get up here to the Heavenside elevator in 5 minutes or I'll send those Russian nurses down to help you. The male ones. I just swung there in my hammock and played the game called Toby Halpert's Place in the Universe. No egotist, I put the sun in the center, the luminary, the orb of day. Around it I swung tidy planets, our cozy home system. But just here, at a fixed point about an eighth of the way out toward the orbit of Mars, I hung a fat alloy cylinder, like a quarter-scale model of Tsiolkovsky 1, the worker's paradise at L5. Tsiolkovsky 1 is fixed at the liberation point between Earth's gravity and the Moon's, but we need a light sail to hold us here. 20 tons of aluminum spun into a hexagon 10 kilometers from side to side. That sail towed us out from Earth orbit, and now it's our anchor. We use it to tack against the photon stream, hanging here beside the thing, the point, the singularity, we call the highway. The French call it le métro, the subway, and the Russians call it the river. But subway won't carry the distance, and river, for Americans, can't carry quite the same loneliness. Call it the Tovievsky anomaly coordinates, if you don't mind bringing Olga into it. Olga Tovievsky, Our Lady of Singularities, patron saint of the highway. Hero didn't trust me to get up on my own. Just before the Russian orderlies came in, he turned the lights on in my cubicle, by remote control, and let them strobe and stutter for a few seconds before they fell as a steady glare across the pictures of Saint Olga that Charmian had taped up on the bulkhead. Dozens of them, her face repeated in newsprint, in magazine glossy. Our Lady of the Highway. Lieutenant Colonel Olga Tovievsky, youngest woman of her rank in the Soviet space effort, was en route to Mars, solo, in a modified Alyut 6. The modifications allowed her to carry the prototype of a new air scrubber that was tested in the USSR's four-man Martian orbital lab. They could just as easily have handled the Alyut by remote, from Tsiolkovsky, but Olga wanted to log mission time. They made sure she kept busy, though. They stuck her with a series of routine hydrogen-band radio flare experiments, the tail end of a low-priority Soviet-Australian scientific exchange. Olga knew that her role in the experiments could have been handled by a standard household timer. A standard household timer, but she was a diligent officer. She'd press the buttons at precisely the correct intervals. With her brown hair drawn back and caught in a net, she must have looked like some idealized Pravda cameo of the worker in space, easily the most photogenic cosmonaut of either gender. She checked the Alyut's chronometer again and poised her hand above the buttons that would trigger the first of her flares. Colonel Tovievsky had no way of knowing that she was nearing the point in space that would eventually be known as the highway. As she punched the six-button triggering sequence, the Alyut crossed those final kilometers and emitted the flare, a sustained burst of radio energy at 1,420 megahertz. Megahertz. I'm accustomed to seeing that as one word, not hyphenated. Broadcast frequency of the hydrogen atom. Tsiolkovsky's radio telescope was tracking, relaying the signal to geosynchronous comsats that bounced it down to stations in the southern Urals and New South Wales. For 3.8 seconds, the Alyut's radio image was obscured by the afterimage of the flare. When the afterimage faded from Earth's monitor screens, the Alyut was gone. In the Urals, a middle-aged Georgian technician bit through the stem of his favorite meerschaum. In New South Wales, a young physicist began to slam the side of his monitor, like an enraged pinball finalist protesting tilt. The elevator that waited to take me up to heaven looked like Hollywood's best shot at a Bauhaus mummy case. A narrow, upright sarcophagus with a clear acrylic lid. Behind it, rows of identical consoles receded like a textbook illustration of vanishing perspective. The usual crowd of technicians in yellow paper clown suits were milling purposefully around. I spotted Hero in blue denim, his pearl-buttoned cowboy shirt open over a faded UCLA sweatshirt. Engrossed in the figures cascading down the face of a monitor screen, he didn't notice me. Neither did anyone else. So I just stood there and stared up at the ceiling, at the bottom of the floor of heaven. It didn't look like much. Our fat cylinder is actually two cylinders, one inside the other. Down here, the outer one, we make our own down, in quotes, with axial rotation, are all the more mundane aspects of our operation. Dormitories, cafeterias, the airlock deck where we haul in returning boats, communications, and wards where I'm careful never to go. Heaven, the inner cylinder, the unlikely green heart of this place, is a ripe Disney dream of homecoming, the ravenous ear of an information-hungry global economy. A constant stream of raw data goes pulsing home to Earth, a flood of rumors, whispers, hints of transgalactic traffic. I used to lie rigid in my hammock and feel the pressure of all those data, feeling them snaking through the lines I imagined behind the bulkhead, lines like sinews, strapped and bulging, ready to spasm, ready to crush me. Then Charmian moved in with me, and after I told her about the fear, she made magic against it and put up her icons of Saint Olga. And the pressure receded, fell away. Batching you in with a translator, Toby. You may need German this morning. His voice was sand in my skull, a dry modulation of static. Hillary. Online, Dr. Nagashima, said a BBC voice, clear as ice crystal. You do have French, don't you, Toby? Hofmannsthal has French and English. I don't know if that's a new person talking next. Oh. You stay the hell out of my hair, Hillary. Speak when you're bloody spoken to, got it? Her silence became another layer in the complex, continual sizzle of static. Hero shot me a dirty look across 2 dozen consoles. I grinned. It was starting to happen. The elation, the adrenaline rush. I could feel it through the last wisps of barbiturate. A kid with a surfer's smooth blonde face was helping me into a jumpsuit. It smelled. It was new old, carefully battered, soaked with synthetic sweat and customized pheromones. Both sleeves were plastered from wrist to shoulder with embroidered patches, mostly corporate logos, subsidiary backers of an imaginary highway expedition, with the main backer's much larger trademark stitched across my shoulders. The firm that was supposed to have sent Halpert, Space Toby out to his rendezvous with the stars. At least my name was real, embroidered in scarlet nylon capitals just above my heart. The surfer boy had the kind of standard issue good looks I associate with junior partners in the CIA, but his name tape said Nevsky and repeated itself in Cyrillic. KGB, then. He was no Tsiolnik. He didn't have that loose, jointed. He was no Tsiolnik. He didn't have that loose jointed style conferred by 20 years in the L5 habitat. This kid was pure Moscow, a polite clipboard ticker who probably knew 8 ways to kill with a rolled newspaper. Now we began the ritual of drugs and pockets. He tucked a microsyringe, loaded with one of the new oh my god. Euphorohallucinogens. Now we began the ritual of drugs and pockets. He tugged a microsyringe, loaded with one of the new euphorohallucinogens, into the pocket on my left wrist, took a step back, then ticked it off on his clipboard. The printed outline of a jump-suited surrogate on his special pad looked like a handgun target. He took a 5-gram vial of opium from the case he wore chained to his waist and found the pocket for that. Tick. 14 pockets. The cocaine was last. Hero came over just as the Russian was finishing. Maybe she has some hard data, Toby. She's a physical chemist, remember? It was strange to hear him acoustically, not as bone vibration from the implant. Everything's hard up there, Hero. Don't I know it? He was feeling it too, that special buzz. We couldn't quite seem to make eye contact. Before the awkwardness could deepen, he turned and gave one of the yellow clowns the thumbs up. 2 of them helped me into the Bauhaus coffin and stepped back as the lid hissed down like a giant's faceplate. I began my ascent to heaven and the homecoming of a stranger named Lenny Hofmannsthal. A short trip, but it seems to take forever. Olga, who was our first hitchhiker, the first one to stick out her thumb on the wavelength of hydrogen, made it home in 2 years. At Turatam, in Kazakhstan, one gray winter morning, they recorded her return on 18 centimeters of magnetic tape. If a religious man, one with a background in film technology, had been watching the point in space where her Aleut had vanished 2 years before, it might have seemed to him that God had butt-spliced footage of empty space with footage of Olga's ship. She blipped back into our space-time like some amateur's atrocious special effect. A week later, and they might never have reached her in time. Earth would have spun on its way and left her drifting toward the sun. 53 hours after her return, a nervous volunteer named Kurtz, wearing an armored worksuit, climbed through the Aleut's hatch. He was an East German specialist in space medicine, and American cigarettes were his secret vice. He wanted one very badly as he negotiated the airlock, wedged his way past a rectangular mass of air scrubber core, and chinned his helmet lights. The Aleut, even after 2 years, seemed to be full of breathable air. In the twin beams from the massive helmet, he saw tiny globules of blood and vomit swinging slowly past, swirling in his wake, as he edged the bulky suit out of the crawlway and entered the command module. Then he found her. She was drifting above the navigational display, naked, cramped in a rigid fetal knot. Her eyes were open, but fixed on something Kurtz would never see. Her fists were bloody, clenched like stone, and her brown hair, loose now, drifted around her face like seaweed. Very slowly, very carefully, he swung himself across the white keyboards of the command console and secured his suit to the navigational display. She'd gone after the ship's communications gear with her bare hands, he decided. He deactivated the worksuit's right claw. It unfolded automatically, like two pairs of vice grip pliers pretending they were a flower. He extended his hand, still sealed in a pressurized gray surgical glove. Then, as gently as he could, he pried open the fingers of her left hand. Nothing. But when he opened her right fist, something spun free and tumbled in slow motion a few centimeters from the synthetic quartz of his faceplate. It looked like a seashell. Olga came home, but she never came back to life behind those blue eyes. They tried, of course, but the more they tried, the more tenuous she became, and, in their hunger to know, they spread her thinner and thinner until she came, in her martyrdom, to fill whole libraries with frozen aisles of precious relics. No saint was ever paired so fine. At the Plesetsk At the Plesetsk laboratories alone, she was represented by more than 2 million tissue slides, racked and numbered in the sub-basement of a bomb-proof biological complex. They had better luck with the seashell. Exobiology suddenly found itself standing on unnervingly solid ground. 1 7/10 grams of highly organized biological information, definitely extraterrestrial. Olga's seashell generated an entire sub-branch of the science, devoted exclusively to the study of Olga's seashell. The initial findings on the shell made two things clear. It was the product of no known terrestrial biosphere, and as there were no other known biospheres in the solar system, it had to come from another star. Olga had either visited the place of its origin or come into contact, however distantly, with something that was, or had once been, capable of making the trip. They sent a Major Gross out to the Tovyevsky coordinates in a specially fitted Aleut 9. Another ship followed him. He was on the last of his 20 hydrogen flares when his ship vanished. They recorded his departure and waited. 234 days later he returned. In the meantime, they had probed the area constantly, desperate for anything that might become the specific anomaly, the irritant around which a theory might grow. There was nothing, only Gross's ship, tumbling out of control. He committed suicide before they could reach him, the highway's second victim. When they towed the Aleut back to Tsiolkovsky, they found that the elaborate recording gear was blank. All of it was in perfect working order. None of it had functioned. Gross was flash frozen and put on the first shuttle down to Plesetsk, where bulldozers were already excavating for a new sub-basement. 3 years later, the morning after they lost their seventh cosmonaut, a telephone rang in Moscow. The caller introduced himself. He was the director of the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States of America. He was authorized, he said, to make a certain offer. Under certain very specific conditions, the Soviet Union might avail itself of the best minds in Western psychiatry. It was the understanding of his agency, he continued, that such help might currently be very welcome. His Russian was excellent. The bone phone static was a subliminal sandstorm. The elevator slid up into its narrow shaft through the floor of heaven. That's with a capital H, by the way. The floor of heaven. I counted blue lights at 2-meter intervals. After the fifth light, darkness and cessation. Hidden in the hollow command console of the dummy highway boat, I waited in the elevator like the secret behind the gimmicked bookcase in a children's mystery story. The boat was a prop, a set piece, like the Bavarian cottage glued to the plaster Alp in some amusement park. A nice touch, but one that wasn't quite necessary. If the returnees accept us at all, they take us for granted. Our cover stories and props don't seem to make much difference. All clear, Hero said. No customers hanging around. I reflexively massaged the scar behind my left ear, where they'd gone in to plant the bone phone. The side of the dummy console swung open and let in the gray dawn light of heaven. The fake boat's interior was familiar and strange at the same time, like your own apartment when you haven't seen it for a week. One of those new Brazilian vines had snaked its way across the left viewport since my last time up, but that seemed to be the only change in the whole scene. Big fights over those vines at the biotecture meetings. American ecologists screaming about possible nitrogen shortfalls. The Russians have been touchy about biodesign ever since they had to borrow Americans to help them with the biotic program back at Tsiolkovsky 1. Nasty problem with the rot eating the hydroponic wheat. All that superfine Soviet engineering, and they still couldn't establish a functional ecosystem. Doesn't help that that initial debacle paved the way for us to be out here with them now. It irritates them, so they insist on the Brazilian vines. Whatever. Anything that gives them a chance to argue. But I like those vines. The leaves are heart-shaped, and if you rub one between your hands, it smells like cinnamon. I stood at the port and watched the clearing take shape as reflected sunlight entered heaven. Heaven runs on Greenwich Standard. Big mylar mirrors were swiveling somewhere, out in a bright vacuum, on a schedule of a Greenwich Standard dawn. They recorded bird songs began The recorded bird songs began in the tree back in the trees. Birds have a very hard time in the absence of true gravity. We can't have real ones because they go crazy trying to make do with centrifugal force. The first time you see it, heaven lives up to its name, lush and cool and bright, the long grass dappled with wildflowers. It helps if you don't know that most of the trees are artificial, or the amount of care required to maintain something like the optimal balance between blue-green algae and diatom algae in the ponds. Charmian says she expects Bambi to come gamboling out of the woods, and Hero claims he knows exactly how many Disney engineers were sworn to secrecy under the National Security Act. We're getting fragments from Hofmannsthal, Hero said. He might almost have been talking to himself. The handler's surrogate gestalt was going into effect, and soon we'd cease to be aware of each other. The adrenaline edge was tapering off. Nothing very coherent. Schöne Maschine, something. Beautiful machine. Hillary thinks she sounds pretty calm, but right out of it. Don't tell me about it. No expectations, right? Let's go in loose. I opened the hatch and took a breath of heaven's air. It was like cool white wine. Where's Charmian? He sighed, a soft gust of static. Charmian should be in clearing 5, taking care of a Chilean who's 3 days home, but she's not because she heard you were coming. So she's waiting for you by the carp pond. Stubborn bitch, he added. Charmian was flicking pebbles at the Chinese big-head carp. She had a cluster of white flowers tucked behind one ear, a wilted Marlboro behind the other. Her feet were bare and muddy, and she'd hacked the legs off her jumpsuit at mid-thigh. Her black hair was drawn back into a ponytail. We'd met for the first time at a party out in one of the welding shops, drunken voices clanging in the hollow of the alloy sphere, homemade vodka in zero gravity. Someone had a bag of water for a chaser, squeezed out a double handful, and flipped it expertly into a rolling, floppy ball of surface tension. Old jokes about passing water. But I'm graceless in zero G. I put my hand through it when it came my way. Shook 1,000 silvery little balls from my hair, batting at them, tumbling, and the woman beside me was laughing, turning slow somersaults, long, thin girl with black hair. She wore those baggy drawstring pants that tourists take home from Tsiolkovsky, and a faded NASA t-shirt 3 sizes too big. A minute later she was telling me about hang gliding with the teen Tsiolniki, and about how proud they'd been of the weak pot they grew in one of the corn canisters. I didn't realize she was another surrogate until Hero clicked in to tell us the party was over. She moved in with me a week later.
A minute, okay?
Hero gritted his teeth, a horrible sound.
One. Uno.
Then he was gone, off the circuit entirely, maybe not even listening. How's tricks in clearing 5? I squatted beside her and found some pebbles of my own. Not so hot. I had to get away from him for a while, shot him up with hypnotics. My translator told me you were on your way up. Oh, not so hot. I had to get away from him for a while, shot him up with hypnotics. My translator told me you were on your way up. She has the kind of Texas accent that makes ice sound like ass.
Ass.
Thought you spoke Spanish. Guy's Chilean, isn't he? I tossed one of my pebbles into the pond.
I speak Mexican. The culture vulture said he wouldn't like my accent. Good thing, too. I can't follow him when he talks fast.
One of her pebbles followed mine, rings spreading on the surface as it sank.
Which is constantly,
she added. A big head swam over to see whether her pebble was good to eat.
He isn't going to make it.
She wasn't looking at me. Her tone was perfectly neutral.
Little Jorge is definitely not making it.
I chose the flattest of my pebbles and tried to skip it across the pond, but it sank. The less I knew about Chilean Jorge, the better. I knew he was a live one of the 10%. Our DOA count runs at 20%. Suicide. 70% of the meat shots are automatic candidates for wards. The diaper cases, mumblers, totally gone. Charmian and I are surrogates for that final 10%. If the first ones to come back had only returned with seashells, I doubt that Heaven would be out here. Heaven was built after a dead Frenchman returned with a 12-centimeter ring of magnetically coated steel locked in his cold hand, black parody of the lucky kid who wins the free ride on the merry-go-round. We may never find out where or how he got it, but that ring was the Rosetta Stone for cancer. So now it's cargo cult time for the human race. We can pick things up out there that we might not stumble across in research in 1,000 years. Charmian says we're like those poor suckers on their island, who spend all their time building landing strips to make the big silver birds come back. Charmian says that contact with superior civilizations is something you don't wish on your worst enemy.
Ever wonder how they thought this scam up, Toby?
She was squinting into the sunlight, east, down the length of our cylindrical country, horizonless and green.
They must have had all the heavies in, the shrink elite, scattered down a long slab of genuine imitation rosewood, standard Pentagon issue. Each one got a clean notepad and a brand new pencil, specially sharpened for the occasion. Everybody was there. Freudians, Jungians, Adlerians, Skinner Ratmen, you name it. And every one of those bastards knew in his heart that it was time to play his best hand. As a profession, not just as representatives of a given faction. There they are, Western psychiatry incarnate. And nothing's happening. People are popping back off the highway dead, or else they come back drooling, singing nursery rhymes. The live ones last about 3 days, won't say a goddamn thing, then shoot themselves, or go catatonic. She took a small flashlight from her belt and casually cracked its plastic shell, extracting the parabolic reflector. Kremlin screaming, CIA's going nuts, and worst of all, the multinationals who want to back the show are getting cold feet. Dead spaceman? No data? No deal, friends. So they're getting nervous, all those super shrinks, until some flake, some grinning weirdo from Berkeley maybe, he says,
and her drawl sank to parody stoned mellowness, like, hey, why don't we just put these people into a real nice place with a lot of good dope and nobody they can really relate to, eh? She laughed, shook her head. She was using the reflector to light her cigarette, concentrating the sunlight. They don't give us matches. Fire screws up the oxygen carbon dioxide balance.
A tiny curl of gray smoke twisted away from the white, hot focal point. Okay, Hero said. That's your minute. I checked my watch. It was more like 3 minutes. Good luck, baby, she said softly, pretending to be intent on her cigarette. Godspeed. The promise of pain. It's there each time. You know what will happen, but you don't know when or exactly how. You try to hold on to them. You rock them in the dark. But if you brace for the pain, you can't function. That poem Hero quotes, teach us to care and not to care. We're like intelligent houseflies wandering through an international airport. Some of us actually manage to blunder onto flights to London or Rio, maybe even survive the trip and make it back. Hey, say the other flies, what's happening on the other side of that door? What do they know that we don't? At the edge of the highway, every human language unravels in your hands. Except, perhaps, the language of the shaman, of the Kabbalist, the language of the mystic intent on mapping the language of the mystic intent on mapping hierarchies of demons, angels, saints. But the highway is governed by rules, and we've learned a few of them. That gives us something to cling to. Rule 1. One entity per ride. No teams, no couples. Rule 2. No artificial intelligences. Whatever's out there won't stop for a smart machine, at least not the kind we know how to build. Rule 3. Recording instruments are a waste of space. They always come back blank. Dozens of new schools of physics have sprung up in St. Olga's wake, ever more bizarre and more elegant heresies, each one hoping to shoulder its way to the inside track. One by one, they all fall down. In the whispering quiet of heaven's nights, you imagine you can hear the paradigms shatter, shards of theory tinkling into brilliant dust, as the lifework of some corporate think tank is reduced to the tersest historical footnote, and all in the time it takes your damaged traveler to mutter some fragment in the dark. Flies in an airport, hitching rides. Flies are advised not to ask too many questions. Flies are advised not to try for the big picture. Repeated attempts in that direction invariably lead to the slow, relentless flowering of paranoia, your mind projecting huge, dark patterns on the walls of night, patterns that have a way of solidifying, becoming madness, becoming religion. Smart flies stick with the black box theory. Black box is the sanctioned metaphor, the highway remaining X in every sane equation. We aren't supposed to worry about what the highway is or who put it there. Instead, we concentrate on what we put into the box and what we get back out of it. There are things we send down the highway, a woman named Olga, her ship, so many more who followed, and things that come to us, a madwoman, a seashell, artifacts, fragments of alien technologies. The black box theorists assure us that our primary concern is to optimize this exchange. We're out here to see that our species gets its money's worth. Still, certain things become increasingly evident. One of them is that we aren't the only flies who found their way into an airport. We've collected artifacts from at least half a dozen wildly divergent cultures. More hicks, Charmian calls them. We're like pack rats in the hold of a freighter, trading little pretties with rats from other ports, dreaming of the bright lights, the big city. Keep it simple, a matter of in and out. Lenny Hofmannsthal, out. We staged the homecoming of Lenny Hofmannsthal in Clearing 3, also known as Elysium. I crouched in a stand of meticulous reproductions of young vine maples and studied her ship. It had originally looked like a wingless dragonfly, a slender 10-meter abdomen housing the reaction engine. Now, with the engine removed, it looked like a matte white pupa, larval eye bulges stuffed with the traditional useless array of sensors and probes. It lay on a gentle rise in the center of the clearing, a specially designed hillock sculpted to support a variety of vessel formats. The newer boats are smaller, like Grand Prix washing machines, minimalist pods with no pretense to being exploratory vessels. Modules for meat shots. I don't like it, Hero said. I don't like this one. It doesn't feel right. He might have been talking to himself. He might have been me talking to myself, which meant the handler surrogate gestalt was almost operational. Locked into my role, I'm no longer the point man for Heaven's hungry ear, a specialized probe radio linked with an even more specialized psychiatrist. When the gestalt clicks, Hero and I meld into something else, something we can never admit to each other, not when it isn't happening. Our relationship would give a classical Freudian nightmares. But I knew that he was right. Something felt terribly wrong this time. The clearing was roughly circular. It had to be. It was actually a 15-meter round cut through the floor of heaven, a circular elevator disguised as an alpine mini-meadow. They sawed Lenny's They'd sawed Lenny's engine off, hauled her boat into the outer cylinder, lowered the clearing to the airlock deck, then lifted her to heaven on a giant pie plate landscaped with grass and wildflowers. They'd blanked her sensors with broadcast overrides and sealed her ports and hatch. Heaven is supposed to be a surprise to the newly arrived. I found myself wondering whether Charmian was back with Jorge yet. Maybe she'd be cooking something for him, one of the fish we catch as they're released into our hands from cages on the pool bottoms. I imagined the smell of frying fish, closed my eyes, and imagined Charmian wading in the shallow water, bright drops beating on her thighs, long-legged girl in a fish pond in heaven. Move, Toby, now! In now! My skull rang with the volume. Training and the Gestalt reflex already had me halfway across the clearing. Goddamn, goddamn, goddamn. Hero's mantra, and I knew it had managed to go all wrong then. Hillary, the translator, was a shrill undertone, BBC ice cracking as she rattled something out at top speed, something about anatomical charts. Hero must have used the remotes to unseal the hatch, but he didn't wait for it to unscrew itself. He triggered 6 explosive bolts built into the hull and blew the whole hatch mechanism out intact. It barely missed me. I had instinctively swerved out of its way. Then I was scrambling up the boat's smooth side, grabbing for the honeycomb struts just inside the entranceway. The hatch mechanism had taken the alloy ladder with it. And I froze there, crouching in the smell of plastique from the bolts, because that was when the fear found me, really found me, for the first time. I'd felt it before, the fear, that's with a capital F, but only the fringes, the least edge. Now it was vast, the very hollow of night, an emptiness cold and implacable. It was last words, deep space, every long goodbye in the history of our species. It made me cringe, whining. I was shaking, groveling, crying. They lecture us on it, warn us, try to explain it away as a kind of temporary agoraphobia endemic to our work. But we know what it is. Surrogates know and handlers can't. No explanation has ever even come close. It's the fear. It's the long finger of big night, the darkness that feeds the muttering damned to the gentle white maw of wards. Olga knew it first. Saint Olga. She tried to hide us from it, clawing at her radio gear, bloodying her hands to destroy her ship's broadcast capacity, praying Earth would lose her, let her die. Hero was frantic, but he must have understood, and he knew what to do. He hit me with the pain switch. Hard. Over and over, like a cattle prod. He drove me into the boat. He drove me through the fear. Beyond the fear there was a room. Silence. and a stranger's smell, a woman's. The cramped module was worn, almost home-like, the tired plastic of the acceleration couch patched with peeling strips of silver tape. But it all seemed to mold itself around an absence. She wasn't there. Then I saw the insane frieze of ballpoint scratchings, crabbed symbols, thousands of tiny, crooked oblongs locking and overlapping. Thumb-smudged, pathetic, it covered most of the rear bulkhead. Hero was static, whispering, pleading. Find her, Toby, now, please, Toby, find her, find her, find... I found her in the surgical bay, a narrow alcove off the crawlway. Above her, the Schöne Maschine, the surgical manipulator, glittering, its bright, thin arms neatly folded, chromed limbs of a spider crab, tipped with hemostats, forceps, laser scalpel. Hilary was hysterical, half lost on some faint channel, something about the anatomy of the human arm, the tendons, the arteries, basic taxonomy. Hilary was screaming. There was no blood at all. The manipulator is a clean machine, able to do a no-mess job in zero-G, vacuuming the blood away. She'd died just before Hero had blown the hatch. Her right arm spread out across the white plastic work surface like a medieval drawing, flayed, muscles and other tissues tacked out in a neat symmetrical display, held with a dozen stainless steel dissecting pins. She bled to death. A surgical manipulator is carefully programmed against suicides, but it can double as a robot dissector, preparing biologicals for storage. She'd found a way to do it, to fool it. You usually can with machines, given time. She'd had 8 years. She lay there in a collapsible framework, a thing like the fossil skeleton of a dentist's chair. Through it I could see the faded embroidery across the back of her jumpsuit, the trademark of a West German electronics conglomerate. I tried to tell her. I said, "Please, you're dead. Forgive us. We came to try to help, Hero and I. Understand? He knows you, see? Hero, he's here in my head. He's read your dossier, your sexual profile, your favorite colors. He knows your childhood fears, first lover, name of a teacher you liked. And I've got just the right pheromones, and I'm a walking arsenal of drugs. Something here you're bound to like. We can lie, Hero and I. We're ace liars. Please, you've got to see. Perfect strangers, but Hero and I, for you, we make up the perfect stranger, Lenny." She was a small woman, blonde, her smooth, straight hair streaked with premature gray. I touched her hair, once, and went out into the clearing. As I stood there, the long grass shuddered, the wildflowers began to shake, and we began our descent, the boat centered on its landscaped round of elevator. The clearing slid down out of heaven, and the sunlight was lost in the glare of huge vapor arcs that threw hard shadows across the broad deck of the airlock. Figures in red suits, running. A red dinky toy did a U-turn on fat rubber wheels, getting out of our way. Nevsky, the KGB surfer, was waiting at the foot of the gangway that they wheeled to the edge of the clearing. I didn't see him until I reached the bottom. "I must take the drugs now, Mr. Halpert." I stood there, swaying, blinking tears from my eyes. He reached out to steady me. I wondered whether he even knew why he was down here in the locked deck, a yellow suit in red territory. But he probably didn't mind. He didn't seem to mind anything very much. He had his clipboard ready. "I must take them, Mr. Halpert." I stripped out of the suit, bundled it, and handed it to him. He stuffed it into a plastic ziplock, put the ziplock in a case manacled to his left wrist, and spun the combination. "Don't take them all at once, kid," I said. Then I fainted. Late that night, Charmian brought a special kind of darkness down to my cubicle, individual doses sealed in heavy foil. It was nothing like the darkness of Big Night, that sentient, hunting dark that waits to drag the hitchhikers down to wards, that dark that incubates the fear. It was darkness like the shadows moving in the back seat of your parents' car on a rainy night when you're 5 years old, warm and secure. Charmian's a lot slicker than I am when it comes to getting past the clipboard tickers, the ones like Nevsky. I didn't ask her why she was back from heaven, or what had happened to Jorge. She didn't ask me anything about Lenny. Hero was gone, off the air entirely. I'd seen him at the debriefing that afternoon. As usual, our eyes didn't meet. It didn't matter. I knew he'd be back. It had been business as usual, really. A bad day in heaven, but it's never easy. It's hard when you feel the fear for the first time, but I've always known it was there, waiting. They talked about Lenny's diagrams, and about her ballpoint sketches of molecular chains that shift on command. Molecules that can function as switches, logic elements, even a kind of wiring, built up in layers into a single very large molecule, a very small computer. We'll probably never know what she met out there. We'll probably never know the details of the transaction. We might be sorry if we ever found out. We aren't the only hinterland tribe, the only ones looking for scraps. Damn Lenny. Damn that Frenchman. Damn all the ones who bring things home, who bring cancer cures, seashells, things without names, who keep us here waiting, who fill wards, who bring us the fear. But cling to this dark, warm and close, to Charmian's slow breathing, to the rhythm of the sea. You get high enough out here, you'll hear the sea, deep down behind the constant conch shell static of the bone phone. It's something we carry with us, no matter how far from home. Charmian stirred beside me, muttered a stranger's name, the name of some broken traveler long gone down to the wards. She holds the current record. She kept a man alive for 2 weeks, until he put his eyes out with his thumbs. She screamed all the way down, broke her nails on the elevator's plastic lid. Then they sedated her. We both have the drive, though, that special need, that freak dynamic that lets us keep going back to heaven. We both got it the same way, lay out there in our little boats for weeks, waiting for the highway to take us. And when our last flare was gone, we were hauled back here by tugs. Some people just aren't taken, and nobody knows why. And you'll never get a second chance. They say it's too expensive, but what they really mean, as they eye the bandages on your wrists, is that now you're too valuable, too much use to them as a potential surrogate. Don't worry about the suicide attempt, they'll tell you. Happens all the time. Perfectly understandable. Feeling of profound rejection. But I'd wanted to go, wanted it so bad. Charmian, too. She tried with pills, but they worked on us, twisted us a little, aligned our drives, planted the bone phones, paired us with handlers. Olga must have known, must have seen it all somehow. She was trying to keep us from finding our way out there, where she'd been. She knew that if we found her, we'd have to go. Even now, knowing what I know, I still want to go. I never will. But we can swing here in this dark that towers way above us, Charmian's hand in mine. Between our palms, the drug's torn foil wrapper. And Saint Olga smiles out at us from the walls. You can feel her, all those prints from the same publicity shot, torn and taped across the walls of night, her white smile, forever. And that was Hinterlands by William Gibson, which is incidentally one of my favorites in that collection because it is dark. It is cool. If there was any short story in here I'd want a turned into either a full novel or a recurring series, that is probably the one. Because I just think the idea of kind of bootstrapping getting alien technology by sending people into, um, the color from out of space or the mountains of madness or some extra dimensional portal, uh, and who come back
almost invariably either insane or dead is kind of like too cool slash spooky slash awesome an idea to ignore. So I think it's pretty neat. Really good horror because it's like, you just know that that's exactly what would happen. we'd Somebody would come back and we'd be like, we got to get out there. And then somebody finds accidentally the cure for cancer and it's going to become a permanent fixture. All right. With that, I am going to have to scoot. I hope people enjoyed. If you didn't enjoy, I'm sorry. I know I kind of mangled parts of that last one because the way the narrative flows is really, really tricky. And since I hadn't read it any time in the last recent past, meaning years, several years, yeah, it was a bit tricky, but hopefully worth it. Next time it'll be more stories from the same collection. Red Star Winter Orbit will probably do, and New Rose Hotel will probably do. I don't know that we will do the one right after that. Two stories at a time seems about right. All right. So yeah, have a good one. I will try to do my other streams throughout the week next week, but I don't think it's going to work. I know I'm not going to be free Monday, and I'm probably not going to be free Wednesday. Hopefully, I'll be able to do this one next week, which would be nice, but we'll see. Scheduling demands being what they are, it is an unfortunate reality. All right. So yeah, thanks. I am Fraggeth. Hope you enjoyed what you heard today, and have a good week. Stay safe. Don't let the bed blip blap dooba doop boop boop skiddly doo doots bite. All right, have a good one, folks. Thanks for tuning in. I'll try and get this uploaded to my YouTube at some point in the next day. Bye.